I'm Michael Bolden, one of the managing directors for the Knight Fellowships here at Stanford. In our first panel, we had a robust discussion with two newsroom leaders in legacy newsrooms adapting to the changing demands of the digital age. In this panel, we'll talk with four people involved in novel ways of sustaining local news organizations. I'll provide short introductions of our guests, but for more in-depth backgrounds, please visit Canvas, our online class platform, which has additional information on each of them, along with more information about their organizations. Also, as a reminder, if you have questions, Erica Bartholomew, our Administrative Director, is circulating index cards. Please raise your hand and she'll be glad to collect your questions. So first, at my far right, we have Sue Cross, who is Executive Director and CEO of the Institute for Nonprofit News. That's a network of more than 180 news organizations that share best practices and training and collaborate on public service and investigative news stories. She is a former Senior Vice President of the Associated Press and served as AP's Los Angeles Bureau Chief. To my immediate right, we have Chris Horne. Chris is a 2019 JSK Fellow and founder and publisher of The Devil's Strip, an arts and culture magazine that focuses on connecting residents of Akron, Ohio to each other by sharing stories about what makes the city unique. And the Devil's Strip, if you don't know, is a term used to refer to the space between tracks on a streetcar line or the no man's land between public and private property. To my immediate left, we have Jiquanda Johnson. Jiquanda is founder and publisher of Flint Beat, an online news publication that focuses on covering the city of Flint, Michigan. She launched Flint Beat in March 2017, and she's worked for the Detroit News, NBC 25, Fox, and the MLive Media Group. At my far left, we have Clay Lambert. Clay has been a newspaper reporter and editor for more than 30 years. Since 2012, he has been editor of the Half Moon Bay Review, which has served coastal San Mateo County since 1898. Last spring, a group of community members bought the Half Moon Bay Review from the Wick Communications newspaper chain. So that's our panel. To quote Fernando from our last panel, he talked about some of these news organizations being the future. The future is now, so let's go there. So first I'm going to turn to Sue Cross because she runs an organization called the Institute for Nonprofit News. Sue, what is nonprofit news? What is this thing that we keep hearing about?
So nonprofit news is one model of news that's growing rapidly, and it shows us some new possibilities around these economic tangles. It isn't a substitute for running a news business. Nonprofits have to run as businesses like other businesses do. But what's happening around the country is that communities that have seen these cuts in their commercial news media or have lost any local media are forming their own news media. This is often journalists displaced from traditional media who are starting these up, but increasingly we are hearing from business people, we are hearing from community foundations, other community leaders calling saying, we have lost our news, can you help us figure out how to get something started? And this isn't just in the US. I just returned from a week in Canada with foundations and government officials and journalists looking at the same issue. The same discussions are happening throughout the UK and other countries as well. So what distinguishes nonprofit news are a couple of things. The biggest one that people go to right away is, well, you get donations. It's based on donations rather than selling things. And to some extent, that's true. The nonprofits we see around the country, and there's somewhere between 200 and 300 of them now, and their numbers are growing rapidly, that 90% of their funding comes from philanthropy. So traditionally, that was foundations that gave them seed funding and started them. Increasingly, it's individual donors, people like you and me, and wealthy individuals who decide to back these things. And that piece is growing. And then they also do business. They hold events. They're very community-based. They get sponsorship. It's not so much like traditional advertising, but more like the sponsorship of programs you might hear on NPR. And they'll find other ways to make money as well, doing training and all kinds of things. So they're feeling their way toward different business models. So that's how they make money. The other thing that I would say really distinguishes nonprofit news is its ownership structure, because it's owned by the community. By law, the way it's structured, the public owns a nonprofit, and it is founded on the basis that it's providing a public service and therefore gets a tax break. And that means it's much more difficult for a nonprofit that's essentially owned by the community and controlled by a board representing that community to fall subject to being taken over by an investor who might strip out those costs and that kind of thing. And that's the other reason I think you're seeing the model growing, is this sense of a public trust and that it's a public good, like your library or hospitals and things like that. And so that's the other foundational difference.
Thank you, Sue. So Jiquanda, Flint Beat is a member of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and you're a relatively new organization. Can you talk to us about why you went that route and what you thought that being a nonprofit in Flint would mean for community news?
I think I went that route because I do provide a public service. One of the reasons Flint Beat was launched is because the residents asked for it. I was working for MLive Media Group at the time, covering City Hall, and we were in the middle of this water crisis. And so residents would talk to me. I'm from Flint. And so residents would talk to me about what was missing, like those news gaps. And they were pretty much tired of seeing crime, water crisis, and sports. And so it was because of the community. Yeah. That I jumped out there without thinking it through and launched Flint Beat. So I'm really grassroots, community-driven news. You find me at meetings that other news media, they don't attend, or they're not even invited to. If you go through my Facebook page, most of those people are residents and people from the community. And so I look at it that way, like this is a real grassroots effort that we do with Flint Beat.
So I read in an article that in 2017, I think you raised $5,000 through advertising or something like that.
I started a modest GoFundMe campaign and I raised just shy of $2,000. And again, since I'm community, 30% of our residents, they do not have internet access at home. Wow. And last year we had this really big recall election. We had about 17 people running for mayor. Then we had about 17 people running for 9 seats on the city council. And I produced a voter's guide, printed 5,000 copies, and we sold ads for that.
Okay, great. And so Chris runs the Devil Strip, which is also a nonprofit, and you made that decision fairly recently, I believe.
Yeah, we're nonprofit-ish.
Okay, so tell us what nonprofit-ish means and why you went that route.
I started as a for-profit. We've been around for 3.5 years. We started March 2015. I think.
Well, you're a journalist,
really
not a mathematician, so it's okay.
I appreciate that. I can't do that math. So we started as a nonprofit, or as a for-profit, because it'd be easier, frankly, than the paperwork that it would have required to be a 501c3 plus, kind of like Jiquanda. I didn't think about it very much. I was just like, I wanted to do this thing and just jumped right into it. Now, after getting to meet Sue and getting to hear some of the other nonprofits working in that field at IRE, a conference in Orlando this year, I thought, well, this would make sense to dabble in this space a little bit. Ultimately, what I want to do, though, is be a community-owned cooperative. So I come from a part of Georgia, middle Georgia, that's not exactly rural, but really close to a lot of rural stuff. And so they have these electrical utility co-ops operating in these areas where for-profit companies never saw the financial incentive to go. And I look at our situation with news deserts in a very similar way. Now, I don't think we're going to get the kind of government support that those utilities got. They got loans that they were able to pay off, but we also don't need quite as much because producing good local journalism doesn't cost as much as running cable and wire, I hope. So I'm pursuing that model, but in the meantime, doing the nonprofit stuff to kind of get a feel for what that looks like.
So are you making money?
Am I?
Well, that's part of it. So who is making money as part of the Devil's Strip?
We've been sustainable-ish since we started. So, it depends on, I'm not good at math. We've already established this. To publish the first issue, we used a little bit of our money. We didn't have a whole lot, but we used a little bit of our money. And then I went and sold ads. It's actually kind of how I got into journalism, was selling ads. And so I knew how to do that. I hustled up some money. We started printing, hustled up more money, started printing more papers, and been on that sort of hamster wheel for a little while. The fiscal agent that we use to be nonprofit-ish allows us to take donations. So we've had some funding support from a couple of local foundations who allowed me to hire some people so that I could be here in this fellowship and not trying to work remotely serendipitously, or not serendipitous. What's the word for no one notices?
You're good. Okay.
I'm also not good at words.
So, Jiquanda, of course, you laughed at the use of, what was the word you used?
Sustainability.
Yeah. Ish.
Yes.
I imagine, so Flint Beat's, it's not even 2 years old, and I imagine you're experiencing some of the same challenges.
Yes. So I started solo. So I was by myself, and when I first started, I left the newsroom. They made some announcement about what they wanted to do at that particular organization, and I wrote my resignation letter while they were having this meeting, and decided I was leaving and put in my 2 weeks. And my last day was March 10th, and Flint B officially launched on the 13th, that following Monday.
Wow.
For 6 months, I functioned like a journalist. Like, I'm covering City Hall, kicking butt, they're chasing me. I'm loving it. 6 months into it, I'm like, I gotta pay my bills. Like, I didn't think this through. Like, the community, they're loving it, but they're not helping me with these bills. And so I had to pick up a day job. So up until this past September, I was still working a day job. Content suffered, though. Mm-hmm. I couldn't cover the city like I usually cover it. Like, I'm a City Hall girl. I leave City Hall, the mayor's calling me, council people are calling me, the residents are like, where are you at? Nobody's here. Even though we have 1, 2, 3 TV stations and then a legacy newsroom.
Wow.
Nobody covers City Hall.
And you weren't able to use freelancers? There were no money for freelancers or anything like that?
Out of my pocket.
Okay.
So I had a young man there's no journalism programs in Flint, and that was a big issue for me, to find writers and freelancers and students that were interested and engaged in covering an area like Flint. And so I did find a young man he was 19 years old. And he had he relaunched the newspaper at his high school, really smart young man, Andrew Roth. And so he covered politics. I can't find anybody to cover Flint City Hall, though. He would do state politics with local angles because everybody was in the city of Flint because of the water crisis.
Right.
That was fun. And then he ended up walking MSU, freshman, writing for the state news after he worked for Flint Beat, which is great, but I can't find.
You can't replace him.
So I launched a journalism program. So I can start shaping young people through journalism. So I think right now we have 16 students. We launched July 9th and we received a grant. So I got a $75,000 grant for a program we call News Movement in Flint. And just starting again this October, we have 16 students.
Are you working with high school students?
They are grades 6 through 12.
Wow, okay.
So it's different, but they are 6 through 12. And I am working with a photographer, Mark Felix. He's an independent, so he does like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and whatnot. But when he came to Flint as an intern for MLive, I can't get rid of him. And then another gentleman, Kofi Myler, he's a visual journalist. He worked at the Freet, but he's been doing journalism since elementary school. So he works with me, and we have people come in and volunteer and whatnot with the kids, and they're working on a big gun project right now with the Trace.
Okay.
And then after that, they're going to do a Flint water crisis project. But I had to re-engage the community in it. Flint schools, they do not have a journalism program. Our local universities and colleges, they do not have journalism programs. And so it was see a need, fill a need.
Yeah.
So on top of what I was doing, working full time, trying to run Flint Beat, I said, oh, let me teach young people.
Just add something
Yeah, like,
else.
why not just add something else to my plate?
Well,
Make my kids participate in my program.
You weren't doing enough, so.
Yeah.
Okay. And Clay, so you have a different model. I mean, so the Half Moon Bay Review was owned by a newspaper chain that decided to sell it, and then several community members stepped up to buy it. So how did that come about? Can you give us some background on what happened just in the spring?
Yeah, so I was minding my own business. I was the editor of the Half Moon Bay Review and also the editorial director for the parent company, which was WIC Communications, in September of 2017. And one day the CEO called me up and said, hey, Clay, funny story, we're going to sell the Half Moon Bay Review. And I thought, well, okay, what does that mean? So there was about a month of just trying to figure out what that meant. And then it became sort of clear what that meant, which when he said, there's these people who want to talk to you on the phone about the market, and there was a private equity firm in Wisconsin that was wanting to know about the demographics, and was it a tourism trade? And it was clear there were no questions about journalism that I was getting from these potential buyers, and so that was concerning. And I thought about writing one of those letters like Jiquanda wrote. My resignation letter. I didn't do that, partly because I didn't have the gumption that she had to start my own thing. But what I did, and frankly I should give him credit, Francis Wick, the CEO of WIC Communications, said, why don't you find a nonprofit to buy it? And I thought, well, I don't know how to do that either. And there was no such nonprofit in existence in Half Moon Bay. So that was sort of the first bright idea, and when I started to connect with local people in the community who I thought understood the value proposition of the local newspaper, and their heads were in the right place, and that they didn't see it as a cash cow, that was sort of the first thing that we thought about, was forming a nonprofit. And we had a interesting phone call with some lawyers from a large nonprofit in the Bay Area that was willing to be our fiscal sponsor, and it was basically an hour and a half of what we couldn't do if we accepted that arrangement. And so we thought, well, that doesn't seem very fun. We wouldn't be able to endorse candidates, wouldn't be able to do some of the sort of political things that we do now. So we didn't go that route.
So you formed a public benefit corporation, I believe. Explain for us what that is.
Yeah, so, and I'll get over my head here pretty quick, but there's, some people might be familiar with B Corps, benefit corporations. Well, a public benefit corporation is sort of like that. They exist in many states, and the way it works in California is you essentially write into your bylaws that you don't simply exist to maximize shareholder value, but that you also exist for some community good. And we thought that was symbolic, both for the public, that they knew what we were up to, and also for people who might invest in the paper, so that they knew they wouldn't 10 years from now decide that that this was a losing proposition and somebody should have told them.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So we keep hearing you all talk about the community got involved, the community did this, the community did that. So who is the community when you talk about that? I mean, and let's start with Chris, because you have a magazine that's for and about the community in all aspects. Apparently, how do you define community?
In a couple ways. So one, I want to steal from Dorica, who came and spoke to our JSK fellows. I just knocked over my water. Also, not good at physical space.
But you're good at comedy. So.
Thank you. It helps with my wife. So community. We are already in community with each other, whether we recognize it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we want to act like it or not. And so I think about that as part of our mission too. So even though we specifically serve communities inside of our geographic bounds, when I first moved to Akron, it was pretty obvious that these different sectors were all separated and siloed, whether there's arts and business and nonprofit and all that good stuff. But also, so our neighborhoods were too, are all siloed off. It was a product of a different time. And wanted to bring these folks together. Wanted to see them connect with each other, whether they were individuals or they were part of these sectors or industries. So I think about, okay, well, we're all in this community together in Akron. We all have sort of this big banner over us, we're Akronites. So how can we bring these folks into community willingly and not just staying in their little bubbles? And so that's how I think about it. So yeah, we serve a bunch of different sub-communities and subcultures and all this stuff, but we're doing it with this goal of a broader sense of community.
So, okay, so now I want to turn to Jiquanda. How do you think about community? Because, I mean, you talk about getting phone calls from the mayor and everybody saying, where are you? This sort of thing.
Yeah, mine is easier.
Yeah.
Flint.
Okay.
I'm hyper-local. I only think about the city of Flint and news that empowers, impacts, and informs people in Flint. So outlining communities, I could care less. When I approach news, our tag is your community, your voice, your news. Mm-hmm. I'm not doing it from the state's voice. I could care less. And a lot of times, I'm not even doing it from City Hall's voice. I'm first going to the residents to put those people in place to see how they feel and what they feel about issues, and that's what I'm there for. So it's really easy for me to define community.
So actually, in a minute, Sue, I'm going to turn to you for your take on that. But before we do that, I don't want to let this question get away from us. So we're 4 years into the Flint water crisis?
And
something like that? Yeah.
Yes.
So what's going on? What's the state of things now? Because we're all curious about Flint, right? And what's going on with the water?
Well, thanks for asking. The city of Flint is still struggling with the water crisis. What most do not know is that it's really not a lead issue anymore. It's more of a medical issue, bacteria. They deal with that ongoing, skin conditions. Residents are still losing hair. But, they tackled the lead as best that they could. They're still replacing the infrastructure. We do have some homes in the city of Flint that have high lead content. I just had a young lady speak at the Society of Environmental Journalists conference, and she said her levels are 78 parts per billion, and federal guidelines 15. And this is more than 4 years later. Mm. And then also, I had them speak with a young lady who had Legionnaire's disease. She survived. Her name is Jasmine, and the health issues that she has after that ordeal. So the city is still going through a lead crisis, despite what you hear on some national news media outlets about the condition of the water. They still can't drink it.
Okay, thank you for sharing. So Sue, let's talk about this issue of community. So you represent, more than 180 news organizations, and all of those communities are different. Are there commonalities? Mm-hmm. Is it different everywhere? Can things be replicated?
There's, to give you a sense of the overall mix of those 180, it's now about 190. About half of them are local in that they're local or state, but the state is very different. So they cover the state government usually, or statewide issues, and that's something that is falling to nonprofits increasingly. So they have a little different community. They may be followed by policymakers or authorities, and they often distribute their content as Neil and Fernando described, in partnership with these organizations that have bigger audiences and bigger brands to begin with. And then about a third are national, and a third, I would say the fastest growing ones, are single subject. So they're expert reporters who cover health or cover social justice. And I would even count Jiquanda in one of those, really being a specialist about water quality and these issues of the water supply. So you get these pockets of expertise. So I guess what that adds up to is they're quite varied. What we're seeing is that the ones that are strong, and some of them are very small and some of them are very well funded from the get-go, but the commonality in that is that they are grassroots. They're growing out of the community, and so they are quite different. They're covering what the community finds important and tells them is important. They do a lot of community engagement. Their mix of revenue varies. And so we don't see that classic kind of business pattern of, oh, we found it, it's a pilot, it works here, let's duplicate it everywhere across the country. What we think we're seeing emerging is a new kind of interaction between communities and the journalists that is tightly woven, it's highly customized, and then they're banding up through INN and other organizations to share resources, kind of connect with each other underneath. But right now, and I suspect for the next 5 years or so, they're going to be highly experimental and they may look a lot different from each other community to community because they are trying to tailor themselves to what people will support and need.
So, Sue, how much growth are you seeing among these type of news organizations?
We're seeing very substantial growth. So they're tiny by standards of global media, right? So there's about 200 around the country, somewhere between 200 and 300. But the pace of growth is really astonishing. While you're seeing this decline in traditional media, they're growing more than 20% year over year. I mean, we're hearing from multiple communities or people launching these every week, and the pace is accelerating. Now, we'll see if a recession dampens that, but right now they're growing very fast and they are gaining financial stability. So one of the big questions in our mind is, if you are bootstrapping one of these, will they survive? And the answer is yes. It's a few really tough years, like you've heard about here. But these organizations, even the tiny ones that are bootstrapping themselves, are surviving. And after a few years, they really start to grow. They get a couple anchor grants. They find some local patrons. And the failure rate's under 10%, like considerably under 10%, which is not at all typical of startups, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit. So something's really happening in this pace of growth and this momentum. And it does give me great hope because I think you are seeing a new form created.
So, Sue, not to keep you in the spotlight, but to follow up on that. So one of the things that's unique about INN, your organization, is that you have standards that organizations have to meet to be a member of INN. So all of these things that form aren't members of INN. Can you tell us a little bit about the requirements and why you have those standards?
Yeah, the requirements started back when the organization was founded about 10 years ago. It was founded by investigative journalists. And they required editorial independence, no advocacy, no publications that were founded by a cause other than serving the public and the reader, and financial transparency. This is always a question mark that hangs really over all of journalism, but in a particular way around nonprofits. If somebody's funding you, are you beholden to them? Do they want to control the coverage? And so stating editorial independence is really important to the readers and to the funders. So they know if I'm giving you $100,000, I don't have any say in what you're reporting, and that they know that up front. And so we do require financial transparency and for them to have published editorial independence policies. Increasingly, we hear from publications that are kind of in a gray area and that they are founded by advocacy organizations that are genuinely concerned about the lack of coverage of their issue, hire professional journalists. They're often doing outstanding work, but they may have a mission that's broader than just informing the reader. And I think we're going to create a separate kind of category for them because they need support. There's nothing wrong or unethical with what they're doing. It's important, but it's different. And we think it's very important that readers know what's different. this issue of trust is also becoming more important, right? People, for that idea of that you have this bond and you know the news you trust and believe, whether you find it on Facebook or shared through another media form. So we see those standards actually becoming more important.
Thank you. So let's tease out this issue of trust a little bit. I mean, because we're all dealing with, news organizations that are rooted in the community. So Clay, especially with the model that you all have undertaken at the Half Moon Bay Review, have you seen an increase in community trust, a decline? Is that something that comes up in the conversations that you have with the public?
I couldn't say our trust was at 7 and now it's at 12. But I can tell you just anecdotally that everybody is very excited and supportive of what's going on at the Half Moon Bay Review. They like that it's owned by local people like them. I am sure, and I have heard some people who think that the investors are up to something, that they have sort of an ego in this, and that they're trying to promote their own values. What I say is, I guess the proof will be in the pudding. I mean, there's certainly no evidence of that so far. And there was, that was always an issue. Whoever owned the paper could have exerted that kind of an influence. So, people are excited about the possibilities and the fact that it's owned by people like them, for sure.
Great. And Jiquanda, everybody seems to be trusting what you're doing. I mean, based on the feedback, you seem to be getting at all levels.
Yeah, I'm like at 200% trust. The elected officials trust me, my residents trust me, other news agencies trust me. They trust me enough to copy my stuff and do it verbatim, even with the typo. So,
and without giving you credit.
Without giving me credit. Like just recently, I broke a story about an NAACP vice president deciding he was not going to support a Democratic candidate because she's gay. I had 2 news agencies call me that morning to get my story, whatever, tapping me for sources. I had news agencies send me scripts so I can read them over before they air stuff on TV and whatnot. But they trust me.
Okay.
And it's important for me, for the residents to trust me, for them to know that I'll do a nice 3-part series on the mayor, but I'll also write when she tries to put a PPO out against a man trying to recall her. That's bullcrap.
Okay.
Like, I'm not judging anybody. I'm just doing my job. I'm just reporting. No personal agenda at all. But I have opinions, but I just keep them to myself, and that's what I'm there for.
Great. Okay. So, our comedian. So, what about Akron and trust?
It sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
It will sound familiar. I don't know if we're at 200% trust. We're working on it. I think about why we need trust, right? It's because we evolved to be social, and this is how we interact with each other. If I don't trust you, I won't do business with you, so to speak. And so that trust is mightily important. We got a lot of trust out of doing a series of stories on the University of Akron and a president there who was doing some stuff that was shady, including trying to buy the ITT Tech chain of for-profit schools that is now out of business. Anyway, I think when people know you're on their side, they'll trust you.
Right.
And like you said, proof is in the pudding. So if you're doing the work, I don't think we have an agenda, but we definitely have a bias. We have a very pro-Akron bias, and so we work through a lens of what's going to be good for this community. Not that we're the ultimate arbiters either. We take that feedback, and so I think that's why we have trust. I think we have trust because we've demonstrated that we're doing this because we love this city.
So one of the things that I think stands out to me as I talk to you 3 who are directly involved in a particular news organization is that you all actually embody elements of trust in your communities, I think. So I'm very curious about your role when you got started, how it's evolved. And Chris, of course, now you're here. Can you just talk about that? You moved from Macon to Akron, adopted that as your community, and now you're here. So take us through that process about what you mean to Akron and Akron means to you.
Well, I don't know if I've actually told you this, but there was a good week or two where I didn't want to take the fellowship if it were offered. The community means that much to me. My life in Akron means that much to me. And the idea of spending that much time away for a while was really hard to swallow. The weather has made up for that. Ultimately what it was I realized I would be able to do more good for Akron after being here and getting to do things like this and meet the kind of people that I'm in the fellowship with and the people that the fellowship brings me in contact with. My role, I've realized, I've mentioned all the things I'm not good at. One of the things I'm not good at is understanding my limitations. And so when we started, I did everything that I could possibly do. I tried to learn InDesign. I sucked at that, so I got a graphic designer. But other than that, I was just like doing all this stuff. Fortunately, other people saw what we were doing and came in and joined the platform, right? And it became a vehicle. The magazine became a vehicle for people in the community to contribute. And even though Akron doesn't have a journalism program, we found people who were close enough to good at this, and we could groom them. We have an ethos, and they followed it, and it started really working out. And so what's happened, my role has really been just sort of to elevate other people's voices at this point. And that was another reason why I felt comfortable coming here, was that, we could bring in more people and we could strengthen the platform, and it could be a better vehicle for more people to get their view of Akron out there. And I don't mean like opinion pieces, not op-eds, I mean like real work. But now I'm rambling. So,
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Okay. And Clay, so you were editor before the community group bought the Half Moon Bay Review. You've been there for a while. Has your role changed at all? Do you see it evolving?
Well, I think so. Probably most people here have been to Half Moon Bay. It's a very particular place. Part of the reason why what we did works, I think, is because it's not Burlingame and it's not Menlo Park. Nobody ends up in Half Moon Bay by accident. You go there with an intent, and so to kind of bring that around to your question, I think part of my role has shifted a little bit in terms of evenings like this, or last week I spoke to the Odd Fellows Hall, and people are more interested to know what we're doing. And it wasn't that long ago that Half Moon Bay was in real serious financial straits. And I don't think it's going too far to say that the newspaper was literally one of the pillars of the community, holding kind of the glue of the thing together. And so I think, my role has sort of evolved a little bit to be not so much, lowercasing all the things that people bring in capital letters, to more sort of speaking for the community and things like this.
So are you sort of the representative of the owners to the community? Is that the way it works?
To some degree. There's also a managing partner who also represents the owners, but that's fair.
Okay, great. And Sue, now you run this collaborative now, but earlier in your career, you were managing new media ventures within the Associated Press. So I'm very interested in that transition for you, from being inside, this 100-plus-year-old organization trying to start something new, to actually being on the leading edge of some of what's happening in news in America.
There are similarities and differences. The similarities are the passion of the journalists, which I think is true across traditional media and new media. The dedication in newsrooms runs really deep. People do this out of a love of their communities and their country, and that really does motivate them, our very traditional kind of patriotic values in a way, even if they're watchdog, tough reporters. The differences that we're seeing from traditional media to these startups, though, are interesting. The AP is a global organization and is pretty nimble, which is why it's survived where others haven't. But still, when you have these large organizations with large boards, they can't turn the ship that quick, and they do have that classic innovator's dilemma of the bulk of their funding coming from things that they know are going away. And what is so striking with these little organizations is that they can take a lot of risk really quick, and they do. And they also, if something doesn't work, they're not wed to it. They drop it in a minute and they say, oh God, that didn't work at all. We're gonna try something else. So they'll just be very frank about what doesn't work. And so they are very nimble and they're well suited to experimenting. The medium size of these things, half of them have a staff of 8 or under, and then half are 8 or more, including some that are up above 100 staffers. But that's up at the top, like ProPublica and Reveal and Center for Investigative Reporting. Most of them are very small. And so they're very flexible, and they're trying to figure it out as they go. And it's that risk-taking that I see as being different, and that community connection.
Okay, thank you. And so your organization is really based on a collaborative model to a large extent.
The way we think of it, I used to talk about this as grassroots journalism, and I got a lesson in botany that actually was quite useful from a woman named Heather Chaplin at the New School in New York, and she said what's really happening in the startup world is you are rhizomes, which I had to go look up. And it's like a forest of bamboo. So if you're a little grassroots, you can be squashed, or you shrivel in the heat really easily. And all this connective stuff that's being built underneath through INN and a few similar organizations, they're all linked together, and they are building a new ecosystem. And that is in partnership with for-profits as well. But it gives them, I think that's also part of the resilience and strength. So I now think of them as a field of bamboo. If you've ever grown bamboo, because it grows here, it's like impossible to kill, right?
Yeah.
You pull up one blade, it's not going anywhere. So that's what's happening.
Okay. And so Jiquanda, you're part of the rhizomes that are shooting all into the ground. So how has that been to your benefit?
So with Flint Beat, when I started, I didn't think about for-profit, nonprofit. Again, I thought news. I find that being part of an institute like INN, we do proposals for projects. I didn't think about it until I started talking to people from INN, which too, also Knight Foundation, Democracy Fund, Jason Alcorn. They just started having these talks with me at the ONA. So I'm a member of ONA, and so I was at ONA, Online News Association. Yeah. And so I'm at ONA September of 2017, and I'm doing one of those talks, and Jason Alcorn happens to be at this table. He's with the Democracy Fund. And so he just starts talking to me about this nonprofit model, and maybe I should think about it. Then I bump into Karen Rutledge from the Knight Foundation, and she's having the same conversation with me. And so I started to think about it differently, like what is out there so far support for journalism that's boots on the ground in communities like Flint that will support the work that we're doing. And I got a fiscal sponsor. It happens to be the community center where I teach the youth journalism program. This is before I even launched the program, though. And so we're brick and mortar because we have an office in there, and I run this program and everything. And they started to teach me grant writing. So I was like, oh, this is cool, I'd rather write a grant than sell an ad. That's just how I feel about it. And so I started to write proposals, and we got funding to build our revenue model through Lion Publishers, through Democracy Fund, with some money that they came up with for a mentorship program called RAMP. And then I also received funding with the Solutions Journalism Network for a gun violence project that we're working on. So when I just started to think about the work that we do differently, doors started to open in a way that I didn't even anticipate them opening. I thought I would be trying to sell an ad here and there and getting money that way, but things just started to change really fast. So I think we started applying for things in April. No, it had to be March.
Of this year?
Of this year.
Okay.
And so now I think, so Lion was I'm really transparent about money, I don't care. So Lion was $7,500, then Solutions gave us $5,000, then someone else who supports my work gave us $10,000. Then I got a $75,000 grant for the youth program. This is less than a year. And it's just thinking about this as a public service. You know, I wasn't making cold calls. I wasn't trying to put together marketing plans and ad packages for people. I just sat down and started writing my butt off, like what I already do. Saying the work that I do, you should support it because you have the money and this is what I'm doing, you know? I did start separating myself from some things. Like now, I mentioned Kofi Myler earlier. We're partnered now, and we're shaping some things under a company. It's called Brown Impact Media. And what Brown Impact Media Group does is we're aiming to launch news outlets in underserved communities, starting with Flint Beat.
Okay.
And so we're already thinking about other products in other areas where they could use the same type of journalism that we're doing in the city of Flint. So he's in Detroit, you know, and so he's working on learning grant writing and writing proposals and those opportunities out there that support this work where I don't have my site with all these ads from car dealerships and, you know, pop-ups and things like that. I just want people to get the news, just be able to get to this news that we're doing here, you know?
Oh, that's awesome.
So.
Thank you. And while I'll get questions from the audience, Clay, are there any collaborative efforts that you're undertaking in Half Moon Bay?
Yes. So also I've been very interested in the Solutions Journalism Network. We've had a couple of training sessions with them. We also partner with Cal Matters, which is a fancy way of saying we print their stuff. So which is a new thing for us because we've always defined our community very in a geographically very precise way. But we have discovered after 120 years that our problems are all of our problems. I mean, whether it's housing and homelessness and traffic are regional things, and it kind of doesn't make sense to just stop those things at the border. So. Yeah, so I'm, and I'm about 6 months behind Jiquanda and Chris in terms of writing grants and looking for other things. So.
Okay, great. So now we'll turn to some of your questions, and I'll throw this to the group, but I think I'll turn to Jiquanda first because you hinted at this. Well, no, you addressed it directly, actually. Could nonprofits be providers to regional or national newspapers and make money?
Great question. I mentioned the $10,000, and that's through Sarah Alvarez from Outlier Media. And the big thing I think with independent publishing is to be able to collaborate and provide content to some of those legacy newsrooms. We're there. We're in the communities. I look up and the New York Times, they're sending freelancers, to my community to cover the water crisis. You can get content from me. So we are collaborating and working to provide products and content to other newsrooms outside of our communities. So Sarah and I just recently did a water rate story together. Okay. So we're gonna see what happens there. And they purchased it, and we're gonna see what happens.
And I'll give a shout out to Sarah Alvarez. She is another JSK fellow working in the city of Detroit, trying to serve that community, mostly through the delivery of text messaging around housing and utility issues. So a huge shout out to Sarah. Chris, is that a model that you've tried at all in Akron? Have you tried providing?
Making money?
Well.
I haven't tried that yet. So all of our collaborations are to amplify the work right now. I've seen situations like you're talking about where people spend money sending reporters in where we might have been able to help. But that wasn't a part of our model, so I can't blame anybody who's done that. I can see it being something that could, be a revenue stream. I don't think it'd be a big enough one to really invest much in. Otherwise, I just like doing the collaborations because it gives us not more reach, but more experience. So we're working with public media in the Akron area to do some series of stories where we do print and online, and they have the audio stuff because we don't know what the heck we're doing.
Okay.
And that was the censored version.
Sue, do you see other members of INN doing this sort of model?
Yeah, there's a lot of distribution, there's a lot of content sharing. The majority, like 3/4 of our members do share content or provide it under a Creative Commons license, which is a little different than copyright. It basically says you can use this. Some of them get paid for that. Many of them will distribute for free because they're trying to establish their brand. They're trying to help the audience discover them. And I think a good example of that came up earlier when you all showed your hands on Who Knows Cal Matters. Cal Matters is sharing content with many, many newspapers, all the big public media in the state. And so it's a little bit of a dilemma for them. They're getting huge reach. Their journalism has huge impact. Their funders fund them to provide that. But if they ultimately have to get readers to support them, do they then get these other for-profit media to chip in for that coverage? Or do they try to get that, hope that it builds enough of an audience they can support themselves? So there's a lot of kind of strategic thinking and experimenting around that. In some states, the nonprofits don't distribute unless they're paid somewhat, and they may have less foundation funding. And then some that have strong foundation funding or individual funding will share it freely. So I think that's a moving target. It's within their mission, but they'll have to be sustainable over time.
Okay. So we have another very interesting question, which Sue, I'm also going to direct this to you because you probably have more experience with this. The Sonoma West Publishing Company, a very small local operation, did a direct public offering to raise money. This person invested after reading an article about it in the New York Times. Do you have an opinion on this model? And I think Berkeley side also.
Berkeley side also has done that. Yeah, I think it's fine. I think communities, again, as long as they have editorial independence, you don't get to, doctor that headline or change how they report something. The community investing in its local publications, like Half Moon or Sonoma, or through donations to nonprofits, I think that can all be healthy.
If I could jump in. So the publisher of Sonoma West is Raleigh Atkinson. He said that the only reason I want to interject is still the power of legacy media. He wanted to raise $400,000 through the DPO, and he had $100,000. And then the New York Times did a story about him, and a week later he had 200,000. So, including people from all over the country who just wanted to contribute to what he had done.
Okay.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes, please.
So I'm curious, why not a co-op in that situation? I hope to ask them this. Direct public offering, if you're not familiar, means that you could all be shareholders in it. The community-owned co-op model that I'm working on would also involve control. You would get to vote on certain things. You get to represent your community on a board of trustees, and so there'd be more access to guide the direction of the organization. So I think it's great. I think that the nonprofits are great. I'm just curious why in those situations they didn't go whole hog. And just give the community the chance, because I feel like the community deserves to own the media that covers it.
Okay. And unfortunately, we're out of time.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us this evening.
My bad.